It never crossed my mind that I would have to sleep on the bathroom floor on my AmaWaterways Nile River Cruise to avoid a downside that no one had warned me about. I instead, of course, had been warned to watch out for things like safety issues, pushy vendors, getting the infamous Egyptian upset stomach. So in the end, how did I find it all? Was it worth it, even with those nights sleeping on the bathroom floor? Welcome aboard, I'm Gary Bembridge. Let's start with the highs. First off, although I knew it would be impressive, nothing had prepared me for the actual grandeur of the sites themselves. My AmaWaterways trip, by the way, was 11 days, started with 3 nights in Cairo, a 7-night Nile River Cruise sailing from Luxor to Aswan and back, and 1 final night back in Cairo. While in that city, they took us to see the 3 enormous pyramids and the Great Sphinx at Giza, where many guests also went on camel rides. 2 other Cairo highlights for me were the Alabaster Mosque at the Citadel of Salah al-Din and, of course, the famous Museum of Egyptian Antiquities. But for me, the absolute best sites were on the cruise itself. At the start in Luxor, we visited the Valley of the Queens to see the remarkable Nefertari's tomb and others like Titi's tomb, who was wife of Ramesses III. In Valley of the Kings, I got to see Tutankhamun's tomb and 3 other magnificent tombs, with the most remarkable being Titi's husband, Ramesses III's tomb, stretching deep into the hillside. We also spent time, which I loved, at the multi-level Queen Hatshepsut's temple carved into the mountainside. This is one of my absolute favorites from the entire trip. Also in Luxor, we explored the almost 250-acre Karnak temple complex, which transported me, by the way, into scenes that I remember from Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile film. We also ventured north to the temple of Hathor, goddess of love, near Qina, with its magnificent blue ceilings depicting the zodiac. Then on the sailings to and from Luxor to Aswan, we called it an Edfu to see the enormous temple of Horus, and at Kom Ombo visited the only temple dedicated to 2 gods, Sobek, the crocodile god, and Horus, the falcon-headed good doctor god. Once in Aswan, we explored the Philae temple, which was moved in its entirety from an island that was going to disappear under rising lake waters to a totally new island. I also experienced 2 things in Aswan that will stay with me forever. First was sailing on a felucca from the Amadalia ship I was on to have afternoon tea at the famous Old Cataract Hotel where Agatha Christie spent time writing Death on the Nile. And second was Abu Simbel. These massive and jaw-dropping temples were moved 62 meters up and 200 meters along to avoid the rising waters when Lake Nasser was built in the 1960s. Ever since I was 10 years old when I learned of this, I wanted to see it. It was the absolute highlight for me of the entire trip. Seeing so much packed into a 10-day trip was something I loved about this trip. Though with so many temples and so many tombs, many people have asked me if I got tomb fatigue. While, of course, seeing so much could have got repetitive, it was not, thanks to the Egyptologist guides. On AmaWaterways, there was 1 per group of 24 passengers. I discovered to become an Egyptologist takes 4-year study, and I found mine, Nermeen, a mountain of information. She was entertaining, knowledgeable, and actually a dab hand at helping us navigate some of the challenges that I will come to later. I came away convinced that Nermeen was crucial in making my trip. So if you ever cruise the Nile, make sure you check just how good the company you're considering is rated for the Egyptologist guides. Fundamentally critical. Another best thing for me was sailing the Nile itself. Unfortunately, there wasn't as much sailing as I'd hoped because the distance covered is not that far. It's just about 140 miles, that's 225 kilometers from Luxor to Aswan, and many days we did not sail at all and we were docked overnight. More on that later, as that brought some really unwelcome downsides. But when sailing, it was beautiful and calming. I especially enjoyed our first day of sailing when all the ships departed Luxor at roughly the same time and raced each other down to the Esna locks, which are between Luxor and Aswan. Only 2 ships can enter the locks at a time, and it's on a first come, first served basis. Watching the ships kind of jostling down the river was really, really entertaining. One of the fun things once at the locks were the vendors in tiny little rowboats that surrounded the ship, shouting up about what they were selling, throwing items up to guests high up on the sun deck and kind of negotiating from there. It was really entertaining and unthreatening, unlike the vendors on land that, again, I will come to a little bit later. Another thing I also really liked was my AmaWaterways fare, as with most Nile cruises, was all-inclusive, and pretty much everything was included. And that included someone on hand guiding us all the time from arrival to departure, which, as you will see later, is really, really important. It was not a cheap trip, and the 11 nights, including pre and post stays in Cairo, cost, based on your cabin type, between about $9,000 and $12,000 per couple, excluding flights. That's about £7,000 to about £9,500. Now, within that fare, I liked that I was met before immigration at the airport and guided through, had all transfers, hotels in Cairo, flights to and from Luxor, the river cruise, entry to all the sites, food, breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea and dinner, Wi-Fi, although it wasn't that good, daily sip and sail hour with all drinks using Egyptian spirits every single evening, Egyptian beers and wines with lunch and dinner, entertainment events, and the cruise manager Wala, and those Egyptologists I spoke about earlier. The only extra costs, by the way, were all optional, and those were gratuities, which were about $250 per person for the land and cruise team, so quite high. Laundry, of course, and then 3 optional tours. Abu Simbel, $350 roughly, because that involved flights. The Old Cataract Hotel afternoon tea, about $50, and those camel rides at Giza pyramids. So all of those were the best parts. Now let me talk about some unexpected lows about Nile River cruising, starting with this really important one. I was told by the crew that there are at least 250 ships sailing the Nile, which means it is very busy because all are sailing that short 140 miles or so between Luxor and Aswan, which is why I saw 50 or more ships docked in some places. For example, as we pulled into Edfu to visit the Temple of Horus, I counted 50 ships there, and I counted even more in Aswan. I actually gave up counting. As there were limited places to dock, ships dock side by side, sometimes 4 or 5 ships deep, and also in rows. And on some occasions, I had 4 ships to walk through just to get onto the bank. It also meant that my cabin often had another ship just literally a few feet away, making it kind of dark. Venues like the dining room and lounge would have the same too. This, of course, happens on European river cruises too, but a difference here created another problem. Unlike in Europe, there's no shoreside power to plug into. In Europe, the river cruises ships seem to mostly switch their engines off and use electricity when they're docked. In Egypt, the noisy and fume-generating petrol or diesel engines run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whether they're sailing or not. And because they dock in rows close in front, I discovered that a cabin like mine close to the front is unbelievably noisy from those engines just a few feet away from you. That's why the first and last night, docked overnight in Luxor, even with earplugs, I ended up making a bed in my bathroom to close the door and try and reduce the noise. It was unbelievably noisy, so make sure you book midship, as cabins at the rear could also have vibration noise from your ship's engines too. This is very key because ships are docked almost every single night. We were docked for 6 of the 7 nights of the cruise. Not surprising, with all the ships, the land-based visitors and the limited sites to go to meant all the places we went were extremely busy. I think probably the worst was the Valley of the Kings, which Nermeen, our Egyptologist, called the Valley of the Tourists. In many tombs it meant shuffling through with lines of people, although other places, including Queen Hatshepsut's temple, Karnak and Luxor temples in Luxor, and in Cairo at the pyramids and the museum, they were all jam-packed too. One good thing about AmaWaterways and doing a 7-night itinerary is they did try and visit when places would be a little bit less frantic. So for example, at the Temple of Horus, we got there mid-morning when the bulk of the ships had finished their more kind of morning visits and were leaving. We called into Com Ombo early evening, and we were the only ship there. And when we went through the Esna locks on the way back to Luxor, we went early morning when there were no other ships. One of the downsides of my Nile River cruise was the vendors and the focus on shopping. it was basically a bit draining. Every site requires visitors to go through a market stall area to get in and out. There is no way round running the vendor gauntlet. The vendors are pushy, they get in your face, and are incredibly persistent. So I found I just had to get ready, walk briskly through, keep my eyes forward, not glance or look at anything, not anyone put anything on me, nor take anything that was offered, and just keep consistently shaking my head saying no, 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 or in fact, la, 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 because that apparently means no. I also, by the way, was not that excited by what was on sale either. It seemed to be, they all seemed to be selling the same stuff. It all looked very mass-produced and very touristy. On the upside, there did not seem to be any other issues like pickpocketing, scams and tricks other than overcharging. Now, Namin told us to aim to pay only about 30% of what they start asking for. The other thing which I was less keen on, although we, to be fair, didn't have a lot of it on our trip, were shopping trips dressed up as excursions. For example, we went to the Luxor Papyrus Institute, which really, in my view, was just a shopping trip. So we did get a short demonstration on how papyrus is made, and we got to paint our name in hieroglyphics on a prepared parchment, kind of in return for the shopping trip. One of the things I must admit that I did constantly think about during the trip was getting the upset stomach that many people warned me about. Mostly because I was worried about the impact it would have on going out on those long trips to the sites, knowing the toilets were limited and generously saying not appealing. I found the toilets overall at the sites were rather grubby, and you had to also pay to use them. They didn't cost much, by the way, maybe $1 or less would suffice. But I would not want to really sit down in most of them. Unlike as a number of people did on the trip, I did not get an upset stomach. To avoid getting one, I was a bit obsessed. I used hand gel all the time and out, including after touching banknotes, as that was a tip someone gave me. I used bottled water supplied by the line, both on and off the ship, including when brushing my teeth and rinsing my toothbrush. I never had ice. I avoided salad. It's actually the first time in my life that I've gone nearly 2 weeks eating no salad, and I only had fruit if it was peeled, and only had cooked vegetables. I noticed, by the way, all the bottles of water had reminders from the manufacturers to check it's sealed before drinking, because what happens is the vendors fill up empty bottles and sell them at the various sites, which is how some tourists actually get upset stomachs, apparently. People that did get upset stomachs told me they found Imodium, which is what I had brought with me, did not really work, but a local remedy the ship provided for free if asked worked. So that's a good tip to remember. Now, the closer I got to going, the issue of safety and security worried me because so many people started raising it. And even when I checked the UK Foreign Office travel advice, it was full of watch-outs. That sense of worry did hover kind of during the trip, because everywhere we went there were armed military and police with barriers, checkpoints, metal screenings to enter every single site, including the hotel, and there's up to 3 screenings at airports. We also had police escorts a few times, like from the airport, and we also had one when we were visiting Kenya. And there was a lingering concern that I would inadvertently do something wrong. For example, Wala, the cruise manager, warned us to never take photos of the police or checkpoints. Be careful taking photos at airports, as many have military aircraft too. Not to even take binoculars out, because that could be misinterpreted as spying or suspicious. And he advised me to not take out some of my camera equipment like tripods, because again that could kind of cause some questions with the authorities. So while that safety was a concern, I found traveling in the AmaWaterways kind of bubble alleviated most of that, because we always had someone with us to shepherd us around the issues, brief us on what to do, and intervene if anything arose. There is, for example, much online about how LGBT people are harassed in Egypt, and that being in that bubble, I think, helped with the LGBT couples on our trip. They were kind of avoid being exposed to any of that risk, because we were always in a group and being shepherded around. So while safety and security were a concern, traveling in the AmaWaterways bubble, for me anyway, made me feel comfortable and reassured. That, of course, for some will be a real downside, because it means you should be staying in the bubble and not truly kind of roaming, exploring, engaging with the locals. I have to say, I never left the bubble on the trip, although we actually didn't really have any time or opportunity to. And I did have amazing time, which if I'd chosen a cabin more midships, would have probably edged that up even more. To get the answers to the most asked questions I keep getting, including what the ships are really like and who should not go, coping with the heat, and a key question that you really should be asking if you're thinking of the Nile, watch this video. See you over there.